So today we are joined by Gonneau Building Group's CEO, Eric Gonneau. Eric is a licensed professional engineer and fifth generation builder. Welcome, Eric, and thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you.
Eric has been building in the Muskoka area, or his family's been building in the Muskoka area for 5 generations. And what a great opportunity it is to talk to someone who has that sort of legacy knowledge in building in Muskoka. Eric, would you mind giving us an overview of your history in Muskoka and your family's history in Muskoka and the stuff that you're up to today?
Um, in the 1870s, my great great grandfather moved to Muskoka along with his family and to a certain extent what remained of his family. They had lost multiple children prior to moving to Muskoka, and they were looking for some cleaner air and cleaner waters outside of quote unquote Southern Ontario, which was quote unquote polluted in the 1870s. And they landed here. Since then, my family's been in Muskoka for generations. The family, while originally coming to think they could be farmers, soon learned that farming in Muskoka was not the best practice. And we've been builders ever since then. My father, my grandfather, my great grandfather have all been contractors in the area. And we've worked in the Lake Rosso, Lake Joseph area primarily and built everything from small sheds to large summer estates.
Well, that's so interesting. And, being in the area for so long, there's just so much like legacy knowledge that gets passed on. And I know within agriculture, families have been working the same field for a long time. They know things about the field that if somebody was to just start working it tomorrow or this year, they wouldn't have that same understanding of how the ecosystem works. Spending 150 years in Muskoka, there has to be those types of things where all the reasons why we love Muskoka, be it the snow, the lakes, the Canadian Shield, all those different things that really like pop when you think about Muskoka, those have to have their own unique challenges when you're tackling that as a builder. And over 150 years honing in on those skills, there's a lot of learnings there. So, are there any of those things where you look at different building techniques and how you guys tackle those challenges of working inside a very beautiful but a very challenging environment?
Yeah, I mean, building obviously over the last 150 years has progressed. And when we
Yeah.
look at the spray foams we have today, we look at the LVL and the TGI beams and everything else like that. We look at all the siding choices we have today. None of that was available and around 100 years ago. I mean, when we got started, you would cut down the trees on a property and sometimes you'd actually mill the trees on the property to use for your lumber to build your structure. And it's obviously we've adapted over the years as the industry's adapted and changed. And it's not only on the building side, but it's also on the planning and design side. 150 years ago, there was no such thing as a building permit nor a site plan. You just built where it was best to be done. And part of that has changed as well in the sense of 150 years ago, you built where it made sense and where it was the best to be able to be in harmony with the land and
Mhm.
be able to use the land features and everything else like that. And that's what we did. And obviously, as times have progressed, we change and we adapt and we go. Some things are better, and some things you still hearken for the old days, and you go, "Gee, I wish I could just do it that way, like my grandfather did." But you go with the times and go with the flows.
Building techniques obviously change over the years. And yeah, there's a lot of really interesting developments when it comes down to building materials. Actually, when I came out of high school, I went into trade school. So I studied carpentry and then worked in the industry for a number of years and then went to university up at Nipissing. But it's really cool to see, even within a 10-year period, the progression that's being made within the industry um, with insulated concrete forms, different things like that, where you have these really cool innovations where, high efficiency passive building and how that plays into better practices within building, energy saving, stuff like that. So I know that's something that you, I think, implemented into your own office or did some work there with high efficiency passive building. Would you be able to explain like what that is and how that affects, homes and home building and why it matters?
So, I mean, just to give you a progression, and I'll get into the passive homes later on, but just to give you an example, 150 years ago, when we got started building, and you wanted to put a foundation in, you carried the largest rocks you could and put them under the building so they wouldn't sink into the ground. And your limitations were what you, and if you had a donkey or a horse there, what they could carry to put your foundations on. And you had a rubbled stone foundation. As time went through, we started to get more hydraulics and other things, and you're able to dig down, and people started putting a concrete block foundation in when concrete blocks were available. And then later on, we start going into more and more poured foundations because nowadays people will rack the concrete truck and pour their foundations. Well, recently, there's even been another advance where we have what's called an ICF foundation, which is a thinner amount of concrete on the inside, but coupled with two styrofoam pieces on the outside, and it's all one piece that's all put together, and you pour your concrete in the middle afterwards. That makes the house more energy efficient, and it obviously reduces your heating bills and allows also for other green initiatives because you need less concrete to be able to do this. So there's less materials and gas and diesel to everything to get it there. And we've recently coupled that with more and more techniques in passive building. Passive building is looking at designing the house, designing the building, shall I say, to use as much passive heat and passive cooling as you can. Are you able to have trees on their south facing slope that are deciduous so that in the summertime they block and they shade, but in the wintertime the leaves are gone, so you're getting the weak sun in February to try and heat your house? Do you have upgraded insulation throughout the house, not only in the foundation, but in the walls and the ceiling and the roof to try and keep the heat in? Are you using passive heat recovery units so that when you have to exchange the air, you're taking the hot air and extracting the heat out of it to put it in the cold makeup air to warm it up that way? Are you being able to use any sort of heat, sand, or water banks in the sense that water and sand retain heat or coolness for a long time? So in the summertime, if you have a bunch of water or sand and you heat it up, it takes a long time for the heat to dissipate in the wintertime. And if you use different techniques to be able to take hot air and push it underground under a concrete floor slab, you may be able to heat the ground underneath there for a geothermal geo earth bank. And then in the wintertime, the same air going through is warmed to be able to warm the structure as well. There are a whole bunch of different techniques. Not everyone makes sense economically. Not everyone makes sense given the location and the site characteristics of the land. And not everyone makes sense given the size of the building. But the whole process is look for it. If you can start to be able to design your building to match the lot, if you can use different foundation materials, different insulation materials, different heating sources, different passive heating sources. Same thing with solar windows, with shades and awnings, because in the wintertime you want the sun to come in. In the summertime, you don't want the sun to come in. Can you extend a roof line out with an awning to block the sun when it's at a higher angle, but let the sun come in when it's at a lower angle in the wintertime? These are all things that you can look at that'll make your house more energy efficient with the ultimate goal of getting how close to passive can I get? How close can I get to the point where we don't need external fossil fuels to input into getting us the heat?
No, that's great. And it's really cool because it helps your bottom line, but also it's a great environmental impact as well by implementing all
Exactly.
those different types of measures. Well, that's so cool. Your family's 150 years in the area. That really brings a strong consultative approach to home building and understanding not just what your clients are looking for in terms of their property and what they're looking to achieve with the build, but then also those really cool, interesting things that maybe people don't know so much about, um, where they can implement some things that help the environment and also help them save some money. When it comes down to your process of designing and building, somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, Eric, we're looking to start a project in Muskoka. We have a piece of land. Maybe there's a cottage on it. Maybe there isn't a cottage on it." Would you be able to walk through what that looks like from start to finish? Somebody approaches you from a high level and just the different stages that someone would be looking at for that type of project when it comes down to, I guess, ideation to build?
Yeah. Sure. It's a whole process that needs to be done. And the first part of the process generally takes a year to 18 months before you start building. And that's a consultation, planning, designing, permitting process. And obviously, we start at the start. What have you got? What do you want? And what will it take to achieve it? Some people are looking for a 1,200 square foot cottage similar to a house. They're just looking for a spot that's there. And that's totally different if someone is looking for a 7,000 square foot showpiece, masterpiece cottage. And it's also different if somebody are looking for a family compound where they have a main building, but every adult child around has their own little bunkie with a couple of bedrooms around in each bunkie trying to support and have a family compound. Depending what people want, depending what the zoning allows on the property, depending what the size of the property is, and of course, depending what their budget are, all need to go into the hopper as we try and figure out what have you got, what do you want, what's allowed, what can you afford, and they all go together. And that takes a couple of rounds usually of us asking questions, them telling us. Sometimes we ask questions and they don't know the answer. They need to go back and consult with others. One of the unique things about building in Muskoka is rarely are we building for an individual. We're almost always building for the family. And so many things are not what one person wants. It's what does my wife want? What do my kids want? What do my grandkids want? How can we accommodate the family? And that's a unique perspective because sometimes there is a driving force and sometimes it takes a while to build that consensus. Once we have a consensus, we obviously come up with some conceptual plans, present them, get some feedback. Yes, I like that. No, I don't like that. How can we do this? Why can't we do that? And we go through an education process and we try and get that. Sometimes it's one round, sometimes it's more than one or two rounds as we go for that. Once we've got all that done, then we have to design it all, choose all the material types, and present it to the town or the township for permitting and get the approval. That obviously takes a chunk of time, and it's variable depending how quickly we can come to consensus and how far outside the box are we thinking and how conventional are we. And then, of course, then we get into the construction phase. And the whole part of the construction phase, as a building company, is what we do, right from clearing the land to the final touch of paint on the cottage. And we do all of that. And then, if everything's come together as planned, then comes the load up of all the furniture and the belongings and the decorating. And that's when the cottage or house comes even more life and be able to see all the
Mhm.
personal touches that are put in. And obviously, if we've planned from the start, you know where your furniture is going, and you know at the start, okay, is this bed a king, queen, or two singles, a bunk bed? Is that's what's intended for this room to make sure you have the space, make sure you have the design and layout to be able to go for it.
That's perfect. And I think that's, a really great feature of working with your company is you're able to help with all those different stages throughout the process, which I'm sure are extremely difficult to navigate if you're doing it for the first time. But if you're, a generational builder or someone who's been navigating these processes for a long deal, especially with Muskoka itself, that makes the process even smoother for somebody who's tackling this type of project for the first
Yes.
time.
If you have seen the end and have seen 5 years after the end, there's always times you go back and say, well, how would I have done that differently at the start? And those are the lessons you learn for when the next client comes in and you're at the start again. They may not have seen the end and they may not have seen 5 years after the end. But when you're there and you're generational, you see it and you go, okay, I think we better steer you this way.
Uh-huh.
You may not think that's a big idea right now, but I think that in 5 years after you move in, you will be thanking me for this
Yeah.
because now you're living in there and it feels appropriate and it gives you the feeling, the energy, the warmth that you want, and not just a sheet of paper that you don't quite fully understand yet.
That's a great way of putting it. And I'm sure throughout your time just driving throughout town, you're looking at different projects and thinking back to those memories of those different builds and even builds that you yourself weren't a part of, but that Alexander, your great grandfather, were. I was reading on your website that the beautiful St. John the Baptist Church on Lake Rosso was actually your great grandfather's project. So there has to be a really cool feeling when you look at that and you say, wow, the nails that were used to put up the trusses and all the different parts of the church, that was my great grandfather's work. Are there any projects that you look back on and think to yourself, wow, that's such an amazing accomplishment that is still standing today that we've as a family have all worked on?
Yeah, so St. John the Baptist Church in Marinas, my great grandfather was one of the congregation that came together to help build that church. But then over the years, the original church building was enlarged twice, and both my father and my grandfather worked on some of the renovations and enlargements and updates and changes over the years. And they've all been involved in that building. Similarly, we have a recently completed project on Fairylands Island that my family has been working with the original owners for three generations on that property. And my grandfather built the boathouse back in the 1950s and some of the bunkies and the main cottage. About 40 years later, when the family wanted some upgrades done, my dad and my uncle were working on that in the late 1990s when they wanted upgrades done and renovations. And then just recently in 2025, my family again was called in again. We were out there again doing renovations 35 years later to redo the boathouse once again and redo some of the bunkies. And in fact, I have in my office here a piece of one of the door frames that has my grandfather's signature on it as the guys were there and pulled it out and recognized the Gonneau signature. And I looked at it and said, yeah, that's my grandfather's writing. And he had written on that because that was one of the pieces he had picked up from the lumber yard and he wrote his name on it to make sure it came out to this boathouse. And here we are 75 years later, taking it out to do a renovation. And there's my grandfather's signature on one of his pieces of wood in the cottage.
That was going to be my next question. How cool is it when you pull out a stud or something and the signature is fantastic. That is so cool. But just to see like, somebody from your family from such a long time ago, just marking a crown, and showing the direction of the lumber, or just like a pencil mark from when they were cutting. That's incredible. That is so cool. That is
Yeah,
so cool.
it's very heartwarming to know, and very much a responsibility that for three generations this family has called us. I don't want to be the last generation of trust.
Yeah.
And that's what we do on the lakes. We've been out there for generations and we have people who as a need. Quite similarly, we're in the design project right now for another family cottage that my father's been looking after for 40 years, and now they've come to us and they want to put an addition on, and we're doing the exact same process for years and years. And this is another one that was, in fact, this was from the owner side. He once again is the third generation owning this cottage, and we're the third generation working on the same cottage on Lake
That is
Rosso.
so cool. That is so cool. Yeah, no, and that's, what, to have that sort of client relationship where the trust is there over that period of time, that just really speaks to your organization's like just core philosophies and building practices. That's incredible. You really, you don't hear of that very often in today's day and age of a company A being around that long and then B getting that sort of repeat business over that sort of period. That's really cool. And
It really shows the trust, and even more so, it's a trust on both sides that when we're in generations like that, rarely is there a contract. There's a handshake.
yeah, exactly.
And
That's
that's all
great.
that's required.
Yeah. No, that's it. I know you probably spend a lot of time working, very busy with your building group. But during the winters, are you a fan of snowmobiling, ice fishing, anything like that? Is there anything that gets you outside in the wintertime?
Yes, I have different passions, and one of them is playing hockey and coaching hockey.
Nice.
and I have played hockey for a number of years. Unfortunately, had to hang up the skates for a bit because I was coaching both my son and my daughter at the same time, and they had 5 nights of the week. We were different games, practices, whatever which direction, and doing that. And but yeah, so I enjoy that quite a lot, and I enjoy cross country skiing, and I get out skiing all the time on the lakes and on the in the back 40, shall I say, and everything else
Oh,
like
nice.
that. My father, who turns 80 this year, I have to say beats me. He still plays hockey 3 times a week, and he's out there still moving around and still doing quite well, and being invited to tournaments, etc. At 79, he's on the ice 3 times of the week.
Nice.
I hope to be back on very soon next year, perhaps, as my coaching duties will hopefully be much more limited as my kids age out and go off to school themselves.
Well, that's awesome. Well, you know what? With hockey, I've learned and, I've seen parents, friends play throughout the years. It seems like a sport where you're able to continually find a team that is both challenging and fun throughout your life. So that's great. And that's such an amazing accomplishment for your dad to still play, 3 times a week. Like that's a great workout. Thank you so much for coming on, Eric. I really appreciate your time. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Sure. A couple easy ways. Our website is greatbuilders.ca, and our telephone number is 705-999-2. And those are the quick, easiest ways to get a hold of us. And we look forward to being able to see who we can help some more on the lakes.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for coming on, Eric. I really appreciate our conversation. I learned a ton. And thanks again for being a guest.
Well, thank you for having me. Talk soon.
Take care.